Good evening, everyone. My name is Anastasia Lijadi. I'm Indonesian, a psychologist, a mother of 2 TCKs, currently as an expatriate, as well as a repatriation wife living in Vienna, Austria. I'm currently working as research scholar in the World Population Department, as well as supporting Director General for Science at the International Institute of Applied System Analysis in Austria. Since last year, I serve as the Research and Education Director of Family in Global Transition, FIGT. I value this organization as its mission concur to my research. Families in Global Transition is a forum for globally mobile individuals, families, and those working with them. We promote cross-sector connections, for sharing research and developing best practices that support the growth, success, and well-being of people crossing cultures around the world. The organization is run by 99% volunteers. We provide annual conference, virtual webinars, dialogue, and other activities, which you can check on the website. The FIGT can only exist because of our members. Therefore, for those who are looking for access to resources online as well as offline in their country of residence, or wishing to connect to like-minded people who may have support resources they need, or who want to be part of the conversation surrounding global living or cross-screen cultures, I really want you to consider to join us. Our membership levels have several prices. For individual is $65 per year. For student or young adult up to 30 years of age is $29 per year. So we look forward to welcome you to be the member of FIGT. So Sarah, can I continue with our main business today?
You can. I do want to make one quick note. The Research Network does have a separate membership outside of FIGT, and to be involved with the research and be connected and be on our listserv, that is separate from the FIGT membership, and that is unpaid because we want to make sure access to education and resources is available to everybody. But of FIGT membership proper will have a lot of other resources if you choose to pay for that service.
Thank you, Sarah.
Through.
So let's now continue with our main business today. How do I convince my graduate supervisor that third culture kids, or TCKs, is a valid research topic? What insights can be gained from examining the TCK terminology? This virtual seminar on the history and future of the term in research third culture kids would like to stimulate discussion on the analytical usefulness and pitfalls of the concept third culture kid. The virtual seminar will consist of a 20-minute presentation, followed by a 10-minute comments from discussants and a 45-minute discussions. Allow me to introduce our presenter, Dr. Danau Tanu. She's the author of book Growing Up in Transit, The Politics of Belonging at an International School, and an honorary research fellow at the University of Western Australia. Danau is an anthropologist researching youth and migration with a focus on third culture kids, international schools, and mixed race identities. We have 2 discussants today. Gertina Johan van Schalwyk is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of School and Educational Psychology. She's also a former associate professor of psychology at the University of Macau, associate fellow and executive member Oxford Symposium for School-Based Family Counseling, and associate for TAOS Taos Institute. Gertina, would you like to greet our audiences?
Yes, I'm very happy to be here today from South Africa, where I now currently live and work, and actually where I am retired, so my work mainly comprises of remembering and reflecting on a wide range of topics, particularly involving children in and school-based family counseling, which I am particularly interested in. Thank you very much for the invitation, and we'll talk some more later on.
Thank you, Gertina. The second discussant is Mari Korpela. She's a social anthropologist and an academic research fellow at the Faculty of Social Sciences in Tampere University, Finland. Mari is currently working on a research project with the title Expatriate Childhood, Children's Experiences of Temporary Migration. Mari, would you like to greet our audiences?
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very inspired that there are so many people here, that there's such a big audience. And yes, I come from Finland, and I'm currently doing research here on TCKs, and I was in an international school just today because the schools reopened here 2 weeks ago. So I'm really involved in this topic at the very moment, but I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Mari. So our virtual seminar today, again, will consist of 20-minute presentation and followed by 10-minute comments from our discussion and then a Q&A. You are welcome to type in your questions in the chat box as we move along with the presentation. Sarah Gonzalez and myself will collect the questions and pass to our presenter or discussants after the presentation. Now over to you, Danau.
Thank you very much, everyone. Welcome, everyone. It's really good to see you. Thank you for making the time to come here. Yeah, like Mari, I'm really inspired by how many people are here. And the main thing I want to do today is open up a discussion to talk about the TCK terminology. And I think a lot of us, I'm guessing a lot of us have been wondering about it, wanting to talk about this, but not quite sure how to articulate that. So today what I want to do is to open up that discussion, not just for this seminar, this will just be the first seminar, but for going forward as we do other seminars as well. The main purpose is to help the TCK research that's going on push the topic further, right? Move forward in the way we study TCKs or third culture kids. So I'll just start. Let me see. Oops. So what are we going to cover today? First, what are the problems that we see in the research field, right? Now, I'm sure a lot of us have noticed the same problems, just going to go through those things and then give a couple of examples of how the kind of research that I'm finding interesting at the moment. And then we're going to go back into the history of the concept of third culture kids. And I think a lot of you have probably heard of USEAM, John and Ruth Hill USEAM, their research in India and whatnot. But we're actually going to go a little bit into the past more than what is usually said in a lot of TCK dissertations and whatnot. And then talk about what the implications are. And the main thing today, what I want is to open up a discussion, have ample time for discussion so that it's not just me talking, but so that we can together as peers in the research community talk about this topic. But before we start, just want to kind of set the tone for not just this seminar, but in general for future seminars, as well as just in general about talking about differences, because I think sometimes with some of the topics, it can end up being divisive, and there's increasing diversity within the TCK community and increasing complexity. And talking about that, I want to just share with you what Ruth van Reken, Dr. Ruth van Reken has told me in the past when I was trying to do my research on third culture kids and publishing my PhD. I said, I'm really scared that I'm going to alienate some people. And she said, well, don't worry about it. Just start with the similarities, because then you can work through the differences and then you'll find a way back to the similarities. Start with what we share in common, and then work through the differences and come back. Don't start with the differences, she said, because if you start with the differences, then you'll just walk on parallel lines the whole time and won't be able to come together. So that's sort of my idea for today. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to say some things that might feel a little bit uncomfortable about the third culture kid concept. So I just want to say that I self-identify as a third culture kid. And it means a lot to me, the concept, even though I might critique it in research. It's something that means a lot to me. So I just want to start with that. So what is the problem that we see in research? Often, you know, I've been doing this since 2008, so 12 years. That's when I started my PhD. And I've read a lot of dissertations on TCKs, and not just from what I've read, but what I've heard from others. It just kind of feels like the third culture kid literature is kind of repeating itself, going over the same themes over and over again. And a lot of it has already been covered by you know, Ruth and David Pollock in their book, Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. And also the other thing I often hear is, you know, why isn't academia paying attention to the TCK phenomenon? Like, why doesn't anybody take our research and, you know, it has a lot to offer, why isn't anybody paying attention? And then another one is graduate students saying, you know, I want to do this for my PhD, my master's, my supervisors aren't taking me seriously. Like, they don't think it's a thing. And also another thing that's often coming up is, you know, the TCK profile. It seems to really resonate with those who have not been expats, who have not moved around so much, such as immigrant kids and, you know, those who go to international schools. It's like, why does it resonate so much with others, and what should we do about it? So that's what I see in the research field. And especially that last question, address that last question. As you all know, I'm just going to assume that you've read Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. As you all know, Ruth has tried to address that using this diagram of, you know, saying they're all third cross-cultural kids, and this is why we share these experiences, but, you know, they come to this experience from different avenues. But what I'm noticing, even though Ruth has done that, what I'm noticing is, in the sense when I go to the international schools and I hear the teachers talk, or even when I'm talking about research with other researchers, what I often hear is, you know, oh, third culture kids are like this. And, you know, those kids over there, they're not really third culture kids. And then I hear the stories and then it's like, well, they sound like they fit the profile, you know? And there's a sense of, kind of wanting to defend the fort, like kind of wanting to protect the boundaries. And so you've got immigrant kids and biracial kids and whatnot, and saying, hey, we really can relate to this, but let us in into the box. But there's sort of like a no, there's something that we're trying to defend here. If we let everybody in, then it's like, you know, it's not going to mean anything anymore. And I'm not saying any particular person is saying this, this is like a general feeling. And I think a lot of people have noticed this as well. And so that's in the public sphere, right? In the public realm, that's how it's being talked about. And then in research, the way it's being talked about is, like I said, you know, you've got the third culture kid studies on the left there at the bottom, talking about it among other third culture kid researchers. And then there's this whole other massive field on migration, on mobility, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, many other studies, where they talk about very similar things, about this experience of being in between, being interstitial, and also, you know, being uprooted and so on and so forth. But it's like, we're not talking to each other. They're having that conversation over there, and we're having this conversation over here, and there's no crossover. So that's sort of the problems I'm seeing. And so what should we do about this? Well, today I'm going to propose that there is a difference between third culture kids being an identity label and the third culture being an analytical concept. And I'm going to try to sort of decouple it, untangle that, and see where we go with that. And also, I'm going to say that third culture actually originally, the way the John and Ruth Hill Useem imagined it or talked about it, is actually a lot more flexible than the way we talk about it today. And also for the graduate students in the room, you know, I want to just remind everyone that concepts are merely tools for understanding a phenomena. And so, you know, the third culture kid concept might work for a certain research question, but it might not work for other research questions, even though those other ones are studying third culture kids. So it doesn't mean that if we're studying third culture kids, we are stuck with a concept and we have to use it, and that there's no other way to study it. I just want to put that out there. Now, like I said, I want to talk about two examples of research on third culture kids. One is by Daniel Long. He did a Doctor of Education at the University of British Columbia. And reading his thesis is Asian third culture kids, study on Chinese students who are educated in a Western curriculum international school. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Daniel Long also self-identifies as a third culture kid. Anyway, reading his thesis, it feels like the research question that he's using is Chinese kids in Taiwan who go to international schools grow up to become third culture kids. And his conclusion, this is one of his last paragraphs. He says, the experience of growing up in an ethnically Chinese household in a Chinese culture, yet educated in a Western academic environment did indeed create a unique cross-cultural identity in these participants. And this experience, he says, mirrors closely the research findings from traditionally defined third culture kids. And so what he did was he interviewed a whole bunch of third culture, Chinese kids going to international schools in Taiwan. And as he analyzed the interview, he found that a lot of what they're saying, the narrative about feeling in between, the cultural issues they're having, and so on and so forth, is very, very, very similar to third culture kids. So again, we see the sense of like, and if we use the cross-cultural kids circles, these kids fall in the educational TCK circle. But it's almost as if Daniel Long's saying, hey, you know what, it's so similar, what's wrong with calling them third culture kids? Should we not? Point is that they've got really similar experiences. Another research I want to bring out is Dr. Anche Rauerda's research. I think she presented at FIGT a couple of years ago. She's an associate professor of British and post-colonial literatures. And for those who are not familiar with post-colonial literatures, it's basically literature written by those from the former colonies. And what happened was, some decades ago, some people in literary studies noticed that there's a lot of authors writing fiction who are from the former colonies, and the themes that they talk about is very similar. They've got this common thread in the themes that they talk about, which is a sense of dislocation, a sense of a loss of culture, a sense of feeling like being in between. They're not native anymore, they've learned English and they're writing in English, but then they're not white as well. And it's like neither nor. And so that's post-colonial literature. But what Anche was studying was actually literature written by former expat kids like herself. She self-identifies as a expat kid, third culture kid. She grew up in different places as well. And I think she's in house. She's here today. So she probably can comment on this better than I can. And she says there's a set of literatures, for example, Life of Pi, which is written by these expat kids. And people talk about it like it's sort of like post-colonial literature, but not quite. And she says because the themes that run through this literature written by former expat kids, talks about the same things. The sense of being a loss, and also a sense of dissonance and sense of not having a place and all of that. It's very similar but different. And what is the difference, she says, is significantly different, she says, from these because of the privileged expatriate perspective of the authors. And she actually, in her book, tries to consider, would the Homi Bhabha's theory work? Because Homi Bhabha, a big name in post-colonial literature, talks about hybridity, liminality. Liminality means between, sort of like not here, not there. He talks about the third space, that space between cultures. And Bhabha actually kind of opens up a space saying, there's no such thing as a pure culture. Every culture is hybrid. And it's almost like he allows us to think of post-colonial, that sort of theory, opens up a space for diversity of the third culture experience, so to speak. But at the end of the day, it's still about race, and it's about, being from the former colonies and stuff. And so Anche concludes that it doesn't fit, and she creates this new term called third culture literature, which talks about dislocation, loss, a sense of loss despite privilege, disenfranchisement, and tacit awareness of neo-colonial influence, but with guilt resulting from that awareness. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, there's a sense that there's a lot of similar themes from those who experience the third, self-identify as third culture kid, and those who are drawn to the post-colonial theories, this similarities in sense of dislocation, loss, and so on and so forth. But it's almost like there's this big giant wall between them. Third culture kid on the one side with mobility and privilege and expected repatriation, system identity, and so on and so forth. And then on the other side, those who are drawn to post-colonial studies, they talk about racial hierarchies, the formerly, and mainly the authors are from formerly colonized countries and whatnot. And so, but why does this big wall exist? It's sort of like we can't talk about, we're talking about the same thing, but we're not talking to each other. It's like there's separate spheres. But has it always been like this is sort of my question. And I think a lot of people will say that, well, when you look at the literature on third culture kids, they go back to 1976. And this is the first time that the term third culture kids appeared in publication. But, and the way they describe third culture kids is very similar to the way it's talked about today. But this is not the first time that they talk about this concept. Ruth Hill Useem actually 3 years before that talked about third culture children. She hasn't coined the term third culture kid yet, but she's talked about third culture children. And in this piece, she doesn't talk about the third culture like it's set in stone. Like it's on this side and there's a box and there's boundaries and it has to be system identities, all of that. It's a bit more flexible. And as you can see on the right, it says 1850, 1950, the colonial and para-colonial third culture, as in there's a colonial third culture, there's a para-colonial third culture. And if you read further in the piece, she talks about variations in the third culture. So there's a third culture of old China hands and third culture of Indian hands. And so what I want to point out here is that she talks about it as though there's all these different kinds of third culture, whereas we talk about it today as though third culture kids are like this, boom, 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 boom. There's a whole list of things, and I'm not saying that that's how Ruth Van Reken intends it to be, but in the public discourse, this is how we talk about it. And also what I want to highlight is that in this piece, she talks about the hyphenated American teenager. While she focuses on the American teenagers who are in India and going to an American school there, she does talk about other types of diversity of kids who are going to that school. And one of them is being a hyphenated American teenager. And here she says, so Chinese American living in China or Indian American living in India. She says, they seem, this set of kids in the school seem to be very confused, internally confused and disturbed about his own identity. If you go down the paragraph, most American white teenagers, and these are the overwhelming majority of American overseas, they learn to dislike or at least at best feel patronizing towards non-elite host nationals. Americans overseas invariably go up in status, are members of an elite, and have special privilege vis-a-vis the host nationals. And so the host nationals with whom the teenagers are more likely to interact are lower status persons in a service relationships like servants and whatnot. And basically she talks about how, because being Chinese American in China and not speaking Chinese, blah, 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 they feel kind of torn in this sort of racial hierarchy as well as being an expat there. And to me, that sort of resonates with the post-colonial literature type of third culture, type of liminality, type of being in between. And also, if you look at the right, Ruth Hill Useem talks about host nationals and third country nationals. So she's very aware of the diversity in this group. But let's go back a little bit further. Men in the this is from 1963. So before Ruth Hill Useem studied American teenagers in India, she was studying the American fathers and the Indian men that they were communicating with. And usually the Indian men that they work together with are Western educated, many of them. Not all of them, but many of them. And here she talks about, the third culture in terms of, it's a shared pattern of relating to each other. And so it's not an identity. It's a way of relating to each other across cultures, and she calls this the third culture, or she and John calls it third culture. But if we go even further, at another article here in 1968, here, American educated Indians and Americans in India, a comparison of two modernizing roles. The way they talk about the third culture is even more flexible. If you look at the top, it says the first domain of modernity pertains to the global modern third culture. So there's a global modern third culture, and some of them are binational, they say, and some of them are multinational. And as we know from the previous articles, there's a colonial third culture. And then if you go down to the bottom, they talk about the world third culture, as in like the whole globe interacting with each other is a third culture. And then they talk about binational third culture, and I wouldn't be surprised if they later talk about multinational third cultures. So this concept of the third culture originally was quite fluid, was quite flexible. It wasn't set in stone, there were no boundaries around it. It was just a tool for looking at studying the intersections of culture, the way people interact with each other. And here again, the interfaces of a binational third culture. Well, let's go back even further. This is called this is a whole book actually, not an article, Western Educated Man in India, a study of his social roles and influence. So before John and Ruth Useem studied Americans and Indians communicating with each other, they're actually just studying Indians who had studied in the UK and who had studied in the US. And the data for this one was taken in 1952 in India, in Mumbai, or back then they were called Bombay. And it's actually quite I find it really fascinating because they're very aware of the way India is very diverse, so they tried to get every cross section of the population. So they had 110 interviewees, and they said, we tried to get Muslims and Hindus and also all the different ethnic groups, all the different language groups, and we'd also try to interview those who came, who went overseas before India became independent and after India became independent. So they're trying to look at the full range of people who were Indians who were educated in the West, or UK and the US. And among these, among these is this very curious, there's a group of the people that they interviewed are from, they say, a more traditional class of students is made up of young people who, as children or young adolescents, are sent to foreign schools, right? So he's talking about Indian kids before they reach the age of 18 being sent to the UK, mainly UK, to go to boarding schools or whatnot to study. And these kids, with only occasional visits back home during vacations, these individuals often attended a succession of foreign schools until they reached early childhood. I read this and I got a bit excited because I'm like, that sounds kind of like third culture kids, parachute kids maybe, but I'm sure parachute kids, the kids who parachute into a country and then you parachute back, that's where the term comes from. I'm sure they I bet if they were alive today, and they probably are, could relate to the third culture kid concept. And if we look further, here, the pink ones, it says the only cases of an all-pervading change. So they were trying to look at how westernized these kids, not kids, but these students become after they go overseas. And how much of American culture, how much of the UK way of thinking do they absorb, and so on and so forth. And on the most part, the Useem say, they absorb some, but not all, and it's not like they completely change, except the ones that go when they're really young. The only cases of an all-pervading change that were uncovered were those of persons who were taken abroad as children and returned to India as adults. And yeah, so I feel like they sound, so I was really happy seeing that because I thought, the kids who are all in all those other CCK circles, they were already from 1955 in Useem's research. And so going back to this, you know, this big wall that we kind of see in the middle, it's like the two literature can't talk to each other. They're not citing each other, not listening to each other, not talking to each other. Is that really real? If, you know, all these kids from both sides of this wall were already included in these studies that that you seem we're doing. And, you know, I find that a lot of the concepts in these two things are very similar. They both talk about an interstitial culture. Third culture kid literature talks about the third culture, and then Homi Bhabha on the post-colonial side talks about the third space. And there's a spelling mistake there, but in between, there's a sense of in between. Bhabha uses the word liminality to talk about it. Unrooted in post-colonial literature is discollocation. Hidden loss, there's loss, you know, both sides talk about loss. And so there's a lot of things that we share in common here. It's just different words. And maybe some things are slightly different. So as Antje mentioned, you know, there's a sense of guilt because of the privilege. And then on the post-colonial side, there's a sense of inferiority. From that comes anger, but really guilt and anger and inferiority, that just to me seems like just different sides of the same coin. So what I'm trying to do here is like, is it possible for us to talk about what we share, what these two literature sets of people share? And if you look at it, and I have Isabel Min to thank, she kind of thought this through with me a few days ago. But what we share seems to be what is psychological or emotional. You know, this universal need for relationship and belonging. When we don't have it, there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of dislocation. You know, not belonging, and so on and so forth. And where we differ seems to be, you know, the structural factors, social hierarchies, class hierarchies, privileges, and mobility. That's also part of, you know, structure. We don't have to, you know, to be human and to be happy, we don't actually need mobility originally. And so that's, you know, sort of, it's things that are man-made, artificial, or in sociology, they say socially constructed, seems to be the thing that separates us. And I've gone a bit over time. So this is, you know, it's still, I'm still thinking these things through, but I just wanted to share with you all so that we could talk about this and bridge this gap a bit more. And I'm gonna hand this back to Anastasia, I think. But as I hand it back, I was hoping that you could, you know, maybe think about, you know, what is your research question, especially for the graduate students in the house? And, you know, is third culture kid really a useful tool for answering your research question? Are there other ways to do it? And is there a way to talk about the third culture in a more flexible way instead of trying to just fit them into the profile? Whoops. Sorry. I think. Yeah, I just want to thank Ruth and Isabel for that. And also, this is probably not the right time, but the FIGT has a bookstore, online bookstore. And if you go, this is from my research, but if you go there, you can get a discount code. And FIGT bookstore has a lot of other resources there as well. I think. Thank you. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Danau. It's a very great presentation in depth and breadth. I find it very insightful. I particularly like the wall, the way you try to connect the two literature. Now I would like to give a chance for our two discussants to make comments. May I first ask Gertina for her comments to Danau presentation, and followed by Mari Korpela. Gertina, please, on to you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thank you, Danau, for the presentation. It was quite interesting, particularly looking into the historical background of the concept of third culture kids or third culture. And something that struck me in this discussion, in your presentation and in the discussion of the whole concept of third culture kids, is how we define culture. And the fact that the Usim's literature started out from a particular sort of lens, looking glass, that comes from the so-called Western culture, but then conceptualizing the Western culture as anybody who is not in the Orient is under the same culture. Now, I am from Africa, and I often consider myself as a white African. My culture is very African in the sense that I have accepted a lot of the values in which I have grown up, in which my heritage, my inheritance comes from, because we've been in the culture in the continent for more than 300 years. So yes, my face might look Western. So if I travel in Europe, nobody questions where I come from because I look like another European. They question Anastasia because she doesn't look European. So am I a Western culture? I don't believe that. And now my question is, what do we see as this transition between cultures? And when am I actually in this third culture? So looking at historical, where the concept of third culture comes from, is that it is considered that space, that culture, whatever you want to call it, where the Westerner is connecting. Now, I think is, in a sense, you mentioned it very much in the post-colonial literature and in the discussions, the dialogues that come out of that. But I think it's when we do consider the concept of third culture kids in our research, we need to ask ourselves very clearly, what do I see as culture? And do I define it in the broad sense? What lens do I use to look at culture and at the peoples that will be part of my research concept? Because if I look at it purely from a Westernized perspective, I am missing out. I am going to lose my audience. I cannot see this as, and the problem with that approach is, and that's a problem that I have if I read Usim's literature from the 60s and the 70s, even the 50s, is that it is very much this kind of the non-cultured the non-civilized has to adapt to me, the superior culture. And even in today's world, I see this perception that we have to be like the Americans, then we have acculturated, and then we miss the point. So for me, very important in this whole discussion about third culture kids, is what does it really mean to be in that interstitial culture, in that middle space, in that space between the cultures. Can I say that if I've lived within my country in different cultural spaces, you are, Danau is an anthropologist. I mean, in my culture, in my country, we talk about 9 different indigenous languages, 9 different ethnic groups, and we're all part of this one culture, the South African culture, which is also different from the Zambian culture. Can I actually say that somebody who grew up in the Northern Cape amongst the Bushmen, that they have also got a third culture? Are they third culture kids? We have to ask more questions about what really are we talking about when we talk about this concept of moving and growing up in different cultural contexts. Instead of being too narrow or too broad, we need to find an agreement in the conceptual frame. that we are using to talk about. And I think that is where it's difficult. My last comment on this is that I think is one of the biggest problems with academia today is that we have developed these silo cultures. I want to call them silo cultures. The sociologist and the linguist and the psychologist don't really talk to each other because maybe you're going to steal my ideas, and then we can't communicate. So instead of working together to understand human beings, we've become extremely silo orientated and separated. And this is what is kind of problematic in our data. I mean, even as a psychologist, even within psychology, we have this concept of you're a clinical psychologist and that one is a social psychologist. And actually we don't talk to each other because you can't tell me that anything about psychology because I'm clinical, or no, you can't tell me anything because I'm social. I mean, we've become this silo effect. I see this particularly in education and in developmental psychology. No human being is just one thing. We are integrated, interlinked, interrelated, and we need to start in academia in particularly, start to talk across boundaries and break down the walls that we have put up, bridging the silo walls that make it difficult for an anthropologist and a psychologist and a social linguist to talk to one another and then have agreement. And I have found in the past that something like systems theory that actually comes out of mathematics, and social constructionism that comes out of a mixture of social psychology and sociology, that these can bring us closer together instead of keeping the distance between concepts. Thank you. That's my comment.
Thank you, Professor Gertina. 3 insights from you. Lens to look at culture. You talk about minorities and the silo culture. Thank you very much. Let's hear from Mari Korpela. Mari, up to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Danau. That was a very nice presentation. And I think it's very important that we look at the history, because as you said, we are now kind of going in a circle and not progressing. So by looking at history, we can think what we should do in the future. If I continue with what Gertina was saying about the culture, I had the same idea that how do you define culture? And for an anthropologist, this idea of having boxes that we belong to one, I belong to Finnish culture because I come from Finland, it just doesn't work. I'm more thinking that cultures are made, and I feel that I don't share even the same culture with my neighbor necessarily, although we share the nationality. And that applies to in the idea of third culture kids. What I have often been thinking is the idea of the host culture, because there is this idea that you are living in one country and there is the culture of that country, but that is not singular. What is happening in that place. And also, especially now in the age of the internet, especially young people are sharing all kinds of cultural things, regardless of where they live. They listen to the same music, they might be into hip hop or skateboarding or whatever, and it doesn't really matter where you live. Dana was talking about Paba and how he said that there is no pure culture, and that's very important to remember, that it's very simplistic to think that there would be such a pure culture. And especially in social sciences, if you go to your supervisor and you start to talk in these terms, you run into trouble. And that's one thing what I was now thinking when Dana was talking about that people go to the supervisors who don't want you to do research on TCKs. And I think one problem is that the term originally was empirical, like, and people use it as an identity label. It's a very important to self-identify as such for many people. But then why it runs into trouble in academia is that we have the third culture kid literature, but we are trying to apply it to various disciplines. So psychologists and anthropologists, educational scientists, sociologists, whoever is kind of trying to apply the same concept and same literature. But then people in those disciplines have different literatures in their head, and especially your supervisors will have, different ideas. I think that's one of the problems, that we are applying it in a multidisciplinary environment. And it comes originally from empirical experience. What I also found very interesting in Danau's talk was this idea about hierarchies and boundaries. That there is this kind of like, well, they are not third culture kids, but we are, and making this. So it's interesting to think, why is it so important to define what's going on there when you want to define that someone is allowed to use this term and someone else is not. Also, what came to my mind is that, yes, it's true for sure that studying TCKs is not necessarily what your supervisors appreciate. But I think from my experience, studying children in general is already a challenge. Because in many, for example, funding agencies often think that it's not real research if you work with children. It's more serious when you work with serious adults. And then I was also one theme that I just scribbled my notes here, so is about the colonial history, because the early literature that Danau was talking about, there is this very strong emphasis on the colonial situation, which is true, of course, even today. We live in a post-colonial world where the colonial history affects many things. But then there are also third culture kids who come from countries that don't have colonial histories. So what about them? How do they fit into this? I would think, for example, a Finnish family that goes to live somewhere as expatriates. But Finland didn't really have colonies. I mean, we had our colonies with Lapland here in Finland, but we didn't go to other countries. So it's good to think how that relates to things. Then to come to the end of Danau's talk, you had I think it was your last slide. You had this, what is your research question? What do you tell your supervisor, or how to reframe it? So I come back to what I was saying before, that the literature on third culture kids is quite limited. And most likely your supervisor will not know about that literature. And that's why the supervisor will say that, well, this is not important. But it doesn't mean that the theme as such would be a problem, but you might need to just think which literature you use, or which from the beginning, like you can use third culture literature, but also to use some other literature and try to frame your research question in a way that your supervisor will understand it better. But this doesn't mean that you are giving up your research topic. You are just framing it in the way that those who listen to you understand it better, because not so many people necessarily know about the third culture kid literature. So yeah, so that's kind of the message I want to give, is that there's nothing wrong with the theme, and I think most supervisors also will not have a problem with the theme, but it's just how you frame it and to which literature you refer to. And one problem of the literature is that it's multidisciplinary, but we try to use it in specific disciplines. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Mari Korpela. I think I gather like insights from you, a little bit overlap with Gertina, but I noticed one is that you highlight on the social discourse happen in one culture can determine, social discourse happen in one place can determine the culture. You're talking about digital opportunities that might shape or change the definition of third culture kids. You talk about the need to have a label, identity label. You talk about how we should be cautioned in using TCK literature and applying to other multidisciplinary. Yep, I hope I captured that. Now I would like to first give opportunity to Danau to address the comments raised by discussants. Afterwards, I have already 3 people that I would like to invite to join the discussion. The first one will be Mary Langford, and then Etty Silber, and then lastly, Monica Wall. We would like to hear about your just submitted paper. So first, let me give this opportunity to Danau to address the discussant's comment, and then I will take over and pass to our audiences. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anastasia, and thanks, Professor Gertina and Mari as well, Dr. Mari Korpela, actually. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not going to address them all because I think a lot of people in the audience would also like to jump in into the discussion. But the one, actually, before addressing your comments, I wanted to make sure that people understand that when I say, you know, there's this sense of wanting to defend the boundary of third culture kid, I'm not talking about the book, right? I think Ruth has, you know, done an excellent job trying to, you know, incorporate all these differences and diversities, and the book just keeps getting thicker and thicker. But I can see like there's this tension of wanting to incorporate, but then, you know, if we incorporate everything, then it's like, is it going to lose its meaning? And so that's sort of like what I want everyone, all of us together to kind of think about. And, you know, how do we, what do we do with this tension that we're feeling? So that's one of the things. And this boundary defending, about what is going on? Like, why do we need to defend the boundary? Well, as Baba says, you know, there's no such thing as a pure culture. But I think a lot of, as human beings, often we don't feel comfortable with that. We kind of want to know that this is it, and like nobody else can come in. And this is what we're seeing in the world, right? The polarization. It's like, this is us over here, and you can't come here, and like, you're just different. And there's some, you know, something about human nature that wants that, like, and when we don't have it, we feel so uncomfortable with it that we just need to keep trying to, build this wall, you know, build the wall. No pun intended, but no pun intended.
Pigeonholing everything and everybody. Pigeonholing, you know, you have to fit into a pigeonhole.
Yeah. And so how do we sit comfortably with the sense of, you know, is there a way to sit comfortably with not having that boundary and being okay with things changing all the time? Like, how do we do that? It's sort of, I guess I'm answering the question by asking everyone else another question. And what does it mean to be in the third culture? I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to shut up because I want other people to talk as well. So back to you, Anastasia.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Danau. So may I invite Etty Silber to raise your comments and questions. By the way, Dr. Etty, I cited your work in my PhD dissertation. Thank you so much. It's mostly on the international school. It's very insightful. So Etty Silber, up to you now.
Well, thank you for that plug for my book and for my research. Indeed, my research was very specific, a particular lens of one particular group. If I could make a plug on, and I've discussed this with Ruth many times, just to add another bubble to the TCK bubble under the cross-culture kid paradigm, the group that's called Other I would encourage us to use ed kids. These are the children who grow up, the children of the international school educators who grow up in the international schools, because that now is a separate group, just like military, missionary, corporate, and foreign service TCKs. But getting on to my thoughts, I agree and I appreciate everything that's been said so far, and I love going back to history. I think we should definitely honor and respect history. Miss Ruth Usim and her husband were writing and studying and observing from a different period of time in history. And since our world has changed, I think this discussion we're having now is very timely, very relevant, and needs to be analyzed. And my particular preference, and this is what I have been teaching in my workshops, in my to my students as well, when I help them understand who they are. As far as the kids in international schools, that's my career has been as an educator and as a school head in international schools in 6 different countries. I see that the paradigm that Ruth has brought us, Ruth Van Recken, of cross-culture kid is the most helpful. Why is it helpful? First of all, it has analyzed all of those other differences, those tiny, tiny differences that people grab onto and say, but what about this? But what about the refugee? But what about the immigrant? But like you mentioned, Danau, what about the kid, the host country national who goes to an international school in their own country? Okay, what about? Okay. Yes, there are differences, but the actual act of crossing cultures is the same for every single one of them. And that it helps my audiences, and this is what I've seen. All of a sudden I hear a sigh of relief. Oh, so that's why I think differently than this one. So that's why I am like that. And I think that's the most important part, is when you can find your place in this paradigm. And the interesting thing I've found is many people find themselves in many of those little bubbles.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
I think what I'm trying to do is help the current graduate students and those doing research to find a concept that works in terms of communicating with people across disciplines or across fields. And so I'm separating the public discourse from the research discourse, right? So I think what you're talking about is the public discourse, and it works really beautifully and people can see it. But what's happening now within the research field is that because using terms like cross-cultural kids and so on and so forth isn't helping those doing research incorporate all the massive amounts of insights that exist already in migration literature, mobility literature, and post-colonial studies, because there's a sense that the TCK researchers are like, they're not talking about what I'm talking about. This one's a bit more special, this one's different. And so we're just gonna talk about it over here, right? So I want to separate the public discourse and the research discourse.
Oh, I get it. I think it would also help the academic discourse as well, because you're all studying the impact of the interaction between 2 cultures. And clearly the impact as a child and the impact as an adult are slightly different as well. Because the key element of third culture kids is during developmental years, as opposed to a third culture adult who goes into the cross-cultural experience as an adult. But then you have, what about the immigrant child, the refugee child, the child of bicultural or biracial marriage? Those are significant interactions, and they all have that similarity of crossing into another culture, understanding the other culture, and now where do I find my place in amongst these cultures? Just growing up as a minority in your culture. Gertina mentioned South Africa. If I could just interject, the white man in Africa is the minority, in fact. And so you have grown up as a minority within your country. So you have your, shall I say, white European values and the way you see your world. And you also now understand Black Africa's values and how they see their world. So you have also crossed cultures as the minority. I grew up as a Jew in the United States, and as a minority, I understood both cultures, knowing the push and pull, and I had to find myself in that culture. So that's why I see the CCK as an important paradigm. I'll shut up.
I want to just interject here. I think we need to move on, but just think about one more concept that links these things together, is the concept in feminist studies of intersectionality. Don't want to say anything more, just think about that, and maybe Natasha move to the next member.
Thank you very much, Etty, as well as Gertina. Well, I have teenagers going to university, so definitely I'm gonna revisit your books about how to coach international students in the university. And now let's welcome Mary Langford. We would like to hear from you. Mary, are you still with us? Mary Langford, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I had to unmute. I wasn't expecting to say anything. I think I'm more from the public field than the academic field as well, but I still feel that the TCK traditional 1976 definition applies to many kids, but there's two more that, there's two more that I think need more research. And one is something that I work in London in an international school, but I think it's happening in various countries, and that is children of, they're immigrants of sorts, but they're very rich immigrants whose families buy their way into the country by investing. They get specialist visas that enable them to move to countries they want to live in where they perceive the education offers more opportunity or there's more economic benefit. So those kids come in with this privilege that you don't necessarily associate with many immigrants in a traditional way. And yet they have a lot of the adjustment issues. Unlike TCKs, they're probably there to stay. So that's another field, another group that I think need to be looked at. And another, and I didn't read the list quickly enough, or we didn't, the bubbles, but it's these kids who are the ones left behind, the ones who sign the t-shirts, kids growing up. And Eddie referred to those kids, in a sense, local children, but they're not always even local children. They're international kids, but who don't move around and who are always the ones who stay behind, whose friends come and go and come and go. So those are two more areas I think that need to be researched.
Thank you, Mary. Last opportunity, may I give to...
Can I say one more thing? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I just think, working as I do in schools still, and I've been 40 years now working in international schools, but just to see any of this discussed beyond this little elite group of us who always go on and on about it, to get that more widespread is so important, because I'm still surprised by colleagues that I meet who just are clueless about this idea, and yet they're working in contexts where they need to know about it. So
that's
whatever
a very good point.
Thank you.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Monica Wall, are you still with us?
Unmute. Also, probably start my video.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be nice, but I'm taking bandwidth here. So thank you so much for inviting me to say something. Thank you so much, Danau, for the clear presentation. I've been reading your research and build-ups, of course, for my PhD that I'm doing, and I'm on the verge of finishing. So I'm really like, hey. In the Netherlands, it's 4 articles that I have to publish. So the 4th article is exactly about the thing that you mentioned, having this difference between looking at third culture as identity at TCK or third culture as a concept. And third culture as a concept, I went part of the same road as you described, with comparing it to Baba, comparing it to hybrid identities, and defining this interstitial part. What is the interstitial? We're somewhere in between, liminal, and how does that show? What was for me very important, all my articles are in English, available, but of course the last one, in which I'm discussing now, is just submitted to the journal and I'm not allowed to share it yet. The first one on leadership, if TCKs compared to non-TCKs have a preference for transformational leadership, has been published. And I can give the details to FIGT, of course. So walking that road about what is the third culture thing, I was also looking for a new term, and what Gertina says about where the power is and the privilege and how you define culture. That's the part that confuses everybody every time. So when I say, oh, I do research about third culture kids, or I'm a TCK, and people go, what? Okay, then connecting it to, you all know this, the confusion is there, and in the business world, and in the, I work as an organizational developer, and in the academic world. And to get beyond that, there needs to be a new, fresh term I hope to coin, but let's see what happens with that. I read in the chat, there's also someone else who said, oh, well, I'm coining a new term as well. So I think that's good to have that challenge. What I would like to add to the discussion now is something as a result of COVID-19. I think also I was about to give a workshop for military attachés and their families going abroad, etc. So that's part of my clientele. But there's a lot of traveling stopped, but also there's this whole discussion, should we still do it this way? So also, will there be less TCKs in the future? Or people with cross-cultural experience because of growing up abroad? Is this indeed the privileged part that we are emphasizing or not? So that's, for me, the thing where I would like to continue researching on. Another thing, yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Sorry,
okay.
We have
That's
like
okay.
9 people on the list. So
yeah,
I would pass it first to Danau. Do you want to comment for Etty, Mary, and Monica?
No, I think I want to hear from other people. So as many people, we only have 15 minutes. So if as many people as possible can talk, that would be lovely. And so everyone, please keep it short and to the point. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, but up to you, Sarah. Go to you, Sarah. Sarah Gonzalez.
Yep, so we do have a couple other people that have raised hands. And so one is Miriam Akhund. Please excuse my pronunciation if I'm not getting it right, but if you want to go ahead and address your question. And I will go ahead and unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay, Miriam.
Hi, can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, everyone. I've just really been enjoying this. I'm a therapist and I'm also doing my doctorate in the field of counseling and existential psychology. And I think what's coming up for me today with all of these discussions is how much confusion there still is, and how much complexity and disparity that exists until now. And what that's suggesting to me is how that could possibly be a good thing in respecting, I guess, the complexity of a TCK. My current research is on TCKs who grew up in Saudi Arabia, and how the perception of people in Saudi Arabia in the public discourse is so different to what TCKs actually experience here, and going to international schools, etc. And I think as a therapist, it's really complicated because people don't always want to identify as, again, something called a TCK because of the kid aspect. And I understand we also have a TCK, adult third culture kid, which also, I'm not sure if that makes sense. And I was one of the people in the chat who was looking into a new term, and how we can sort of maybe give up the idea of including everyone, and understand and respect that these disparities and these differences are equally as important, and that we're not excluding, but we're holding multiplicity instead of trying to find an umbrella term. That's my contribution.
Perfect, thank you. We have Nagnon. I can attempt the last name, but I may not get that right. Nagnon also raised a hand with a comment. Thank you again, and again, thank you, Miriam, for that.
Okay, so my question is, I don't know, like some others said, there is it's really complex in that you talk about international schools and all this. When I know that, for example, some experiences show that these international schools and so on are not really, if you want, putting the people, the kids in the culture of the larger community. They tend to live, many of them, in a closed community, and in such a way, whatever they have has perceptions of the other culture is still, I would say, what you might, that might be somewhat a little bit above the tourist level of the vision of the perception of the culture. So, for example, if that community lives, almost they have their shops and all these, then would the kids that occasionally would go in the larger community still be part of the TCK? The second question I have is that in these schools, maybe the language of that community will be learned as a foreign language and so on, and may not be really, if you want, fully developed in the child. So that language aspect, is it taken into consideration in dealing with the TCKs? I'm done. Thank you.
I could address that issue about the language.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think it's the topic, we'll cover it in future seminars, but we only have 10 minutes. So I'd love to hear from Antje and Daniela as well before we end. Antje?
Oh, okay. I didn't realize you were, okay. Okay, I'll be quick.
I hand up, so
I did. I think, Danau, I think the question that you opened with about uncoupling TCK identity and TCK research, or TCK as an analytical term, is going to give the answer. I really do. I think it's very exciting, because I think the identity label, and even if the term evolves, great, needs to be inclusive, right? Because everybody wants belonging. So I think we can cultivate that in the identity aspect of the term, but analysis needs to provide distinctions and needs to provide categories, which doesn't mean to exclude anybody or hurt anybody's feelings. It's not about that. It's about useful categories for analysis. So where third culture is a category for analysis, even if we change the term, and I'm excited to hear what people are cooking up. I think the clearer our distinctions are analytically, the more helpful they can be, especially as we try and cross disciplinary lines. So I think the answer to the problem is, you started with it, is uncoupling the two terms, right? Like uncoupling what we do with cultural identification, belonging, what we need as individuals and as humans versus what we need as scholars within our respective disciplines. That's my main thing. Thank you so much for the talk.
thank you. Daniela, are you there? Thanks, Anja.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thank you, Danau, and thank you for everybody that took part in putting this together. I really value that, and Danau, I think you did an amazing job. So what I would like to ask and maybe address is, I'm sitting here as a psychotherapist that believes strongly that the research has to be better connected to our work, our reality. So what I'm facing is that I have to educate my colleagues to understand not only the terms, but the context, and why do we as therapists have to care about it. So I do believe that we have to care about it, because otherwise we will give, you know, the wrong direction to what we are doing, and we might be doing more harm and rather than help. So my question for you, all the researchers, is how do you see that connection, that bridge? What would you like to see from the research coming into the field? And is it something that you even, you know, passionate about, or is it of any importance for you? Because I hope it is, because I really think it's needed. So I want to be, we know, among the ones that encourage you to write, but also to publish and to get it to the field. I need your voices when I'm trying to make it a field by itself, when I'm trying to convince other psychologists to specialize in that and really understand that. So I really value all the researchers, but I need you to be more vocal and more accessible. So thank you.
Thanks. That is a good comment in regards to encouraging publication. We have one last raised hand, Raquel, and then I'll turn it over to Danau for a closing. Are you there?
Yeah, yes, I'm here. Hi, I just was closing the door. I have children around. So I just wanted to really make a comment, and it's not so much a question, but this is a really exciting meeting for me, session. I remember many, many years ago when the research network was founded, I don't know what, like 12, 13 years ago. And I was myself doing my graduate work, and how disconnected it felt from the rest of the academic world. And I think in a way, you know, I left that area, more of like the TCK research, you know, because I didn't feel like I could really belong within like an academic setting coming from that framework, right? So it's really exciting for me to come back to this, right? To this meeting, and to hear that people are talking about power and privilege and post-colonialism and race, and bringing some of these frameworks together, right? And I think For me, when I began studying TCKs, you know, and I share this maybe for the other graduate students who are there, I thought, well, if there's something there that I could, you know, what is it that I really want to study about it, right? And for me, it was this concept of cultural homelessness, and which has become something that has permeated my work, you know, looking at working with refugees and immigrants and kind of expanded from that. But I think like being able to operationalize some of our, you know, our like what we are studying, right? I think that gives a lot of more scientific, let's say scientific credibility to what we're doing, right? So I think it's okay to use terms such as TCKs, right? But I think we can't silo and come from only that literature, right? It has to be able to connect. And I think that there's a really good job or opportunity for all of us, all of you. And I really appreciate the last person who spoke a little bit about, you know, putting our voices out there. But I think like the connection and like bringing down that wall, right, belongs to us, right, to be able to bring that in. So I just want to thank Danau for your talk. It was really, really wonderful to participate, and it's really wonderful to be here. So thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. I think that was a great way to end. Thanks for the comment. It's kind of like summarize the whole thing that we're trying to do. I'm gonna have to listen to the recording again myself to absorb all the questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And this is just the start. Like, this is just the very beginning. Hope you'll come back again so we can talk more. Next month, in June, we're gonna have Dr. Mari Korpela to actually give a talk about her research. So she's done 2 fieldwork. Actually, Mari, do you want to just introduce what you're going to talk about next time?
Yes. So as we have already now discussed today, the world has changed since the 70s, and I think what is important is to discuss the diversity among third culture kids. So next time I will talk especially about class differences. Now, I have studied children in India and also now in Finland, and they can be called TCKs, but when I studied my research, I didn't know the term at all. So I'm going to talk about how I came into this field and which kind of perspectives I had before and how it works. But the class differences will be the main focus.
Thanks. And I think Sarah, FIGT Research Network handle, has just posted the link to register for this next one. And it's on the same upcoming FIGT page. We got 2 minutes. Anything else, Sarah and Anastasia?
I want to say one final comment, and that is that we have to be very careful that we do not confuse culture and politics. I have just seen some commentary in the chat box about being a South African and a white South African and post-colonial and apartheid. And we have to be careful. I don't consider myself as being an elite. I am a minority. And the fact is that culture is not politics, but there is politics in everything that we do. So I appreciate, thank you very much for including me in this discussion, and I wish everybody all the best with their research on the third culture kid and on the challenges that every person experiences through different periods of life, and moving from one time frame in your life to the next, becoming part of the elderly culture is a new experience for me. Am I in a third culture now? Because I am moving into a new culture, that of the older generation, and I have to deal with ageism and all these kind of things. Now in COVID-19, it's particularly relevant. So we are addressing a conceptual topic that is very complex, and we should be careful not to confuse it with a lot of other issues. Thank you very much for participation.
Thank you, Gertina. And I just want to wish the audience that hopefully with this first initiative from FIGT Research Network will encourage you to join us to become a member of FIGT. And if you still have difficulties to convince your graduate supervisor on the topic of third culture kids, come back to us. I'm sure Danau will jump to it, and we can always refer to our resources that might be able to mentor you throughout your study. Back to you, Sarah Gonzalez and Danau Tanu for closing.
Thank you. I do want to circle back around. There's been a few things in the chat box. Always reach out to us at our email, research@figt.org, if you want to engage in other ways, other platforms, or if you have research you would like to share and try to figure out a way. We are accepting proposals. This is just one webinar in a series. Again, we're looking forward to the next session on June 26th, same time, and the link was shared in the chat. We really appreciate everyone coming in, no matter what town you in. We know it's late evening or very early in the morning for some people. This is just a great start for continuing the discussion in regards to research in the field, and we're excited that we have many people participating and that it's a great conversation starter. So we want to keep this going. Thank you again for the participants for the session, Danau for your presentation, as well as for Gertina and Mari for your contributions with the discussion, and for all of you in the audience for participating.